Well, thanks, Tom, and good morning, colleagues and friends. Is there anything left to say about Australian official war histories? That's not me. That is Gavin Long asking the question in his address to Section E of the Australian and New Zealand Association for the Advancement of Science when it met in Canberra in 1954. That's 62 years ago. Well, there must have been more to say about Australian official war history, because Long went on for a further 6,000 words on the subject. But Long's paper is a fitting start for today's proceedings, and essentially we're rephrasing Gavin Long's question, and through the day we'll offer responses which may differ in detail to his responses, but those questions and those answers may inform today's proceedings more generally. Now I want to begin with Gavin Long, and he's the bloke on the left. I want to begin with Gavin Long because it's with the second and subsequent official history projects that we can discern, as Long entitled his paper, an Australian war history tradition. It's with the development and the future of that tradition that we're concerned today. Now, my paper today, this morning, might seem to get the day off to a bit of a lopsided start because it deals with our two largest official history projects in the same time as each of the other speakers today. But let me assure you that concentration is deliberate. I'd be the last person to deprecate Bean and Long's achievements, but our intention today, certainly my intention, is to focus on more recent projects and to draw conclusions and lessons that Craig Stockings and his colleagues may consider and apply. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to discuss the legacies and the lessons that come out of Charles Bean's 15 volumes and Gavin Long's even larger 22 volumes. The logic of this decision is that while we would all, of course, want to acknowledge the two giants of our tradition, our focus today is to draw on memories, observations of official historians who can offer reflections for those who continue that tradition. Now, I'm conscious today that I'm the only speaker who has not held a commission as an official historian or as the writer of a volume of official history. But having metaphorically followed Charles Bean's and Gavin Long's footsteps, now actually not metaphorically, literally followed in their footsteps in writing books on the two world wars, I might have something to offer. I think it's fitting to recognise these two titans and founders of Australian official history writing and to ask as a preliminary to today's deliberations, what might we draw from the practice of these two men? Well, the first observation to note is the longevity and genealogy of official history. It has many progenitors, but its lineal antecedents in the Western intellectual tradition are, as Martin Ball discussed yesterday, William Napier's History of the Peninsular War, William Siborne's book on Waterloo, Alexander Kinglake on the Crimea, and John Kay and George Mallison's history of what they called the Sepoy War. They were all written by what we might regard as gentlemen scholars, and I'm pleased to say that's an aspect of the tradition which of course continues. But at that point, this essentially amateur strain was joined by the staff history tradition, best known in its Prussian manifestation, of course. It was also practiced in British India, whose army headquarters published from the 1860s a series of histories of frontier and colonial expeditions. And of course the South African War produced a multi-volume, but at best quasi-official Times history. So this prehistory is important to note, I think, because when Charles Bean turned his attention to the suggestion that he would write an official history of Australia's part in the Great War, he had various models to call on. And we might observe that what Bean produced was significantly different to any of the models available to him, or at least that his history represented a hybrid of some of those approaches. Well, let me briefly sketch some of the characteristics that I suggest of his history. As you well know, and as we discussed yesterday, it was based on personal experience, observation and recording. His first two volumes were, in the absence of a developed archive, largely based on his own notebooks and on his contacts amongst protagonists and survivors. Bean had lived among headquarter officers from 1914, and much of his history was written from the perspective of divisional or corps headquarters. If it wasn't GSO mess talk turned into history, it bears the imprint of the men among whom Bean felt comfortable. And he drew upon them both for evidence and for analysis. His was an intensely personal history, as we agreed yesterday. Bean's admiration for Brundle White, his distaste or discomfort with John Monash. Unlike his British counterparts, who were all regular officers, Bean and the men he selected for his volume were essentially journalists. Now that gave their work a notable fluency, but it deprived them of an awareness of that staff history tradition, which perhaps is now more infused into our tradition as it developed. As a result, and I'm not the first to observe this, Bean's history omits or fails to grapple with many military technicalities, as Michael McKernan mentioned yesterday. Blamey's criticism of the deficiencies of Bean's history, his relative neglect of the role of artillery and changes in its use through the war is perhaps only the most egregious of those shortcomings. Even more important, though, I think there's perhaps the key characteristic of Bean's history, his celebrated placement at the centre of his narrative of the experience of the frontline soldier whom he named and quoted and celebrated and mourned. And the most striking departure from those previous histories is that focus on the individual. Finally, I think we need to notice, and we did yesterday, how Bean's official history was both a product of its time and of Bean's conception of the nation at that stage in its development. He explicitly hailed Australian sacrifice and achievement, for example. In this, Bean's history expressed a grand narrative, working out aspects of Bean's ambivalent feelings in the relationship between Australia and Britain, between the city and the bush, between truth and falsehood, all were worked out through his notebooks and then the text of his history. Well, I wonder what grand themes Craig Stocking's authors might write about. They may not become very exercised about Australia's relationship to Britain or ponder Victorian ideals such as war's effects on the national character, but they may reflect on the nature of our pluralist democracy, on our continuing relationship with the United States and our dealings with regional neighbours. Well, even while recognising those characteristics which gives Bean's history its period flavour, we should also acknowledge what an achievement it was. Despite their original naive schedules, they produced an impressive series drawing on what grew to be a huge stock of paper records. And though it's uneven, both between Bean and his authors, and within Bean's volumes, I'm struck by the contrast in coherence between Volume 4 and Volume 6. And I think that testifies to the toll that Bean's mission took on his health. But of course they produced an official history which was a fitting memorial to the AIF, even though they may have deterred subsequent research by its comprehensiveness. Now, as it's obvious, I admire Bean and his achievements, but I'm conscious of Lloyd Robson's qualifications and criticisms of Bean's official history. In a review sparked by the first boom in Bean studies in the mid-1980s, Lloyd argued that Bean seemed unable or unwilling to contemplate the possibility that the whole war might be, far from a crusade, a European-centred economic and civil war in which the European imperial systems involved their colonies. Well, that might add up, perhaps, to no more than that the observation that Bean was a product of his time, just as Craig Stockings and his colleagues will produce histories that are products of our time. Historians of imagination and insight can understand the past better than most, but who can step outside time? Finally, the other notable feature of Bean's history, worth noting especially today, is that Bean established not just a tradition of writing official history in this country, he established a tradition of reflecting on the process. In 2 articles in the Journal of the Royal Australian Historical Society in 1938 and in Historical Studies Australia and New Zealand in 1942, Bean discussed his sources, methods and some conclusions, and then his techniques, and they're both still worth reading. Bean never stopped reflecting on, and as we heard yesterday, even correcting years after publication. Getting it right mattered to Bean, as it does to all of us. Well, let me now turn to consider Gavin Long, and you notice that I'll probably use more time talking about Bean than Long, and as it always is. In his chapter reflecting on the evolution of Australian official war histories in the recent Festschrift celebrating Professor Robert O'Neill's career, War, Strategy and History, David Horner rightly observes that Long has received less recognition, but his work was equally impressive. Long wrote 3 out of 22 volumes, perhaps the smallest proportion of any general editor, I don't know, I'm not very good at sums, but his series was the largest, comprising 5 sub-series, Army, Navy, Air Force, Medical and the Civil series. Now, it's certainly true that Gavin Long has received less attention. When establishing which books we might display in the exhibition Charles Bean Life and Work, which opened in the Academy Library yesterday evening, as well as some 19 books by Bean, we identified another half a dozen books which were either about him or which reflected on his experience as a participant observer in the Great War. And they included at least 2 biographies, Dudley McCarthy's Gallipoli to the Somme and Peter Rees's Bearing Witness, not to mention Ken Inglis's seminal lecture, C.E.W. Bean, Australian Historian. but also a shelf full of works analysing Bean's struggle to tell the truth as war correspondent, such as Ross Coulthard's Charles Bean, and several others in which he's the central figure, such as Janda Gooding's study of the 1919 Gallipoli mission. And Bean appears as an actor, or a source, or as a foil, or a footnote, in literally dozens of works on Australia's Great War. In fact, it seems impossible to write reflectively about that subject without also considering Bean's role as chronicler, creator of archive, collections, setter of historical interpretation, or indeed as a character in the narrative. And as usual, in discussing Gavin Long, I've managed to bang on about Bean. So the way in which Long has been overshadowed by Bean is suggested by Alan Ives' bibliography, which Michael Piggott mentioned yesterday, which exposes a paucity of articles by and especially about Gavin Long. It was published in 1978, but it would require little revision today, which is very sad. In contrast to Bean, Long has attracted no biography, and besides his entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography by Bill Sweeting, a man notable for being, and Bill Sweeting's portrait of Long is drawn from life and written by a close and devoted colleague. It's really worth reading. Many here will learn with regret that Bill Sweeting died on the 20th of July at the age of 98. I went to his funeral and was reminded of Bill's lifelong regard for Gavin Long. Gavin was mentioned as much in Bill's funeral as was Bill, because Gavin Long died 48 years ago, just weeks after Bean. And at Bill's funeral I sat next to Pat Clark, who mentioned that the Canberra Historical Journal had published in 2007 a long memoir of Gavin Long by Bill. And Bill's memoir gives many insights into the man, into Gavin Long and his way of working. And just to take one example, Bill quoted from a letter that he had written to the sculptor John Dowie, who created a bust for the War Memorial soon after Long's death. And Bill wrote how, as an editor, Long kept before himself constantly a view of the whole work and was able to remind authors of matters beyond our own view. In this, Long was perhaps more a team leader than Bean had been. I'm sorry to find that the only other essay discussing Long's work is one I contributed to a collection that Jeff Gray assembled called The Last Word. It's over there. Published in 2003. And I just discussed Long's relationship to the War Memorial, which is the home and publisher of his history, which is an astounding lack, 48 years after his death. And of course, this is another instance in which Jeff is a presence at this conference, because I was recalling Jeff's interest in official history while I was preparing my paper, and I asked him just last week if because I knew that he'd worked on these papers, I asked him if he had any plans to do more. He said, yeah, a short biography of Gavin Long was amongst the many projected papers, works on his to-do list. So there are striking parallels between Bean and Long. Both were the sons of clergymen, as Tom's just alluded to. Both were the Bathurst connection. Both lost the faith of their boyhoods. Both were journalists, and their histories bear the imprint of their callings, both in the style and tone and the composition and selection of their writers. Both were tall, and neither could drive cars. Long was appointed, of course, on Bean's recommendation. And both, of course, were also herald men, a fraternity at least as secretive and possibly more powerful than the Masons. They met in the 1930s. Bean would have read Long's articles in the Herald on the train going to work from Lindfield to Central. But the relationship between them seems to have been unequal. And the photographs hint at it too. I'm not sure that Bean is convinced by the thing that Gavin Long's trying to tell them there. We didn't do it that way. And there's evidence of this too. In acknowledging Bean's advice in the preface of To Benghazi, Gavin Long's first volume, Long did so by a very awkward phrasing. In all this planning, Dr. Bean's help was constantly obtained. Now, it's possible that Bean provided more help than was sought, and I wonder if Bean expected Long to follow in his footsteps in method and tone. But Long shaped his project to a different time and a different war. And in his 1954 ANZUS paper, Long's acknowledgement of Bean could be described as cursory. And given the stature that Bean's history had enjoyed for more than 30 years, it's not surprising that Long strove to establish the credentials of his own history by asserting the qualities of his own venture. Indeed, the expectations on Long were arguably greater than on any of the official historians under consideration today, and with respect to those in the room. Bean had focused mainly on the achievement of the infantry, of course, and devoted separate volumes to the Light Horse, the AFC, the Navy, New Guinea, and the war at home. and arguably disproportionately in most of those cases. And Bean's desire to tell the story exhaustively suffused his project. A similar detail in Long's project could not be expected. From the outset, Gavin Long decided that his series, he said, need not be as detailed as the official history of the last war. Now that might sound paradoxical, because Long's series had to do justice to a much larger military force, one that fought over a dozen campaigns in diverse and challenging environments, with naval and air contributions much more complex than in the First World War, and with consequences for civilians, their government, the economy, science, that demanded that so it means that the second largest series in Long's series is the civil. Long's volumes are notable for taking a much more utilitarian and even prosaic approach. Long deprecated what he called purple prose. And I nearly quoted some passages from Gavin Long to dispute that, because if you look at Long's own volumes, there are instances where his writing is magnificent. The crossing of the start line at Bardia, the evacuation of Crete, and the final landing of Balikpapan. But those passages would only reveal Long to have been a highly competent writer. I think a better test of his enduring quality is that his analyses, although constrained both the tenderness towards contemporary reputations and a lack of awareness of sources such as Ultra, Long's analyses remain worth having, at least as a starting point for further work. Perhaps the only significant shortcomings of Long's series are that, first of all, he didn't deal in one volume with the higher direction of Australia's war, and he failed to do justice to the experience of prisoners of war. Now, the first deficiency, I think, was, if it was a deficiency, was rectified handsomely by David Horner's PhD thesis, published as High Command in 1982, and arguably it's volume 8 of Long's first series. And the second, about prisoners of war, the boom in prisoner of war studies, which followed Hank Nelson and Tim Bowden's 1984 series, Australians Under Nippon, encouraged studies of prisoners of war. So in the end, perhaps no harm was done. As David Horner pointed out, it's perhaps debatable whether Long could possibly have adequately dealt with the higher direction of Australia's war as long as Signals Intelligence records remain closed, and they remain closed for the whole of his life. But I wonder why Long didn't follow the example of his New Zealand counterpart and devote an entire volume to prisoners of war, perhaps written by Bill Sweeting, who wrote part 3 of the Japanese thrust. Well, I suggested something earlier. I suggested that something's not a tradition until it's been done at least twice. In that, Gavin Long might be seen as the real progenitor of the Australian official history tradition. In March 1957, Long addressed a meeting of the Canberra and District Historical Society discussing sources of contemporary Australian military history. Long was a very reluctant public speaker, and that may explain his living in the shadow. He reflected on the conditions under which a contemporary war historian worked, and he prefigured today's discussion. He talked about, but very discreetly, about he and his overseas counterparts disagreed over methods and the interpretation of sources. And he had a particular argument with Kent Roberts Greenfield, his American Army counterpart, about whether official history could be written except by the generation that created the records. So abundant had the records become. And Greenfield said, unless you write it promptly, you can't write it adequately or correctly. Well, given the difficulty of even finding some of the crucial sources for the recent deployments and how the presence of senior officers might make candour difficult, that might be a question in the minds of some in this audience for the future. Long concluded that the advantages the contemporary historian enjoys outweighs his handicaps. And I wonder if Long's successors might agree. Is a history commissioned within a decade of conflict's end easier to manage than one with a greater distance? This, it seems, is an important argument to which Long directs us, and one that can only be answered in relation to particular projects and particular conflicts in question. Those in this audience now engaged in writing official war history might pause to ask whether and how they resemble or differ from Bean and Long in the endeavour which coalesced in Bean's mind about a century ago. Are they, like Bean, grappling with a nascent nationalism? Do they have an agenda, a vision of Australian society that their work articulates? Do they proceed with little more than their notebooks, hints and leaks from staff officers, and what official records they can belatedly organise? And of course not. The present official historians are overwhelmed with evidence and in more complex forms than Bean or Long ever contemplated. Are they, like Long, conscious of a gaggle of senior officers and politicians looking over their shoulders? Will Craig Stockings write an appendix, as Long did in his last volume, called Too Many Generals? Will their aim be, as Long put it, to crystallise the facts once and for all, to establish a story that will carry conviction in other countries and satisfy the men themselves that it is an adequate memorial? Well, a very different Australia might amend the men themselves to the people of Australia, but we probably agree that Bean and Long created histories that carry conviction and which constitute adequate memorials. Whether they continue to satisfy the people is perhaps debatable. But Charles Bean, reflecting at the end of his task in 1942, spoke about the great theme that ran through his history, the reaction of a young, free, democratic people to what he called the great test of war. And this, he thought, tied national history into the everyday life of our people. It would surely be a fine thing if the forthcoming official history would bring to their works into the everyday life of our people. I wish them the best in that endeavour. Thank you.
Questions, please.
Guy at the front. And can I say, while Tom's fiddling with the microphone, that I don't necessarily want questions, I want to stimulate discussion. So I'd like you to talk to each other as much as you talk to me. But you can talk to me. So.
And I'll call you Mr. Burness.
I wonder if in your examination of Long, you've looked at that sort of false start in before his appointment in an official historian, and the appointment of Kenneth Slessor.
Yeah.
Which always struck me as being weird.
Yeah,
I mean, he was a great writer, but he came from that myth-making magazine, Smith's Weekly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I always think of Darlinghurst Nights whenever I think of Kenneth Slessor. He's quite the wrong sort of chap. Thanks. That's a really important point. And this is why we need a biography of Gavin Long, because we just don't know the answer to these questions. People may, you may, but that's a really good point. That who on earth thought that Kenneth Slessor could possibly be? I mean, maybe on the grounds of Dr. Bean was a great stylist. Ooh, here's a great stylist. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, we just don't know, do we? But that's a, and maybe Kenneth Slessor had. Did he withdraw? Did Kenneth Slessor have the wit to realise that he wasn't adequate to that task? Yeah, good. Thank goodness. Yeah, because it could have all been different. Oh, sorry, Liz McGuinness.
Peter, I've been sitting here thinking about journalists to professions and that transition which has occurred in writing professional history. Does it have anything to do with purpose? Who tells the official historian what the purpose is meant to be of what they're producing, and for whom are they writing?
Thanks. That's. I think we should have a conference to discuss that question, because it seems to me that you've expressed several complex ideas in there. I mean, the first thing is that there was virtually no developed historical profession, no mature historical profession in Australia, even into the Second World War. In Bean's series, Ernest Scott was brought in, and I think I'm right in saying he's the only academic involved. So journalists were then virtually the only source of trained writers. So it's an obvious place to start. And that might explain why journalists are the preeminent carriers of the tradition up to the appointment of Robert O'Neill. But who tells the official historian? Well, I think that the Staff College answer to that is nobody tells the official historian, except that, of course, that we're now talking about a tradition. And that I don't think we should talk about instructing official historians, but I do think we should talk about the expectations that official historians feel, partly based on their perception of what their predecessors did, although Bean had no predecessors, so Bean had intellectual predecessors, but no, they made it up as they went along. But I think this relationship is much more complex, because Long clearly had his own ideas, and he also had discussions with the Curtin government's, ministers. So clearly he thought that he had writing instructions, but I don't know what they are, because there's no biography of Long. But again, if anybody knows, because people may have looked into this and I haven't, but they're the sort of questions that we ought to be asking. And can I suggest too, we ought to be asking them of other official historians in the room. I mean, Peter Edwards, do you feel you may want to talk about this later this morning, but did you feel you had writing instructions? Oh, he has a microphone in his hand.
I just happen to have the microphone here. I am going to comment a bit on this in my paper, so perhaps I won't say too much at this stage. I mean, there's this theme of journalist to professional historian, and also for whom are we writing? I will make some comments on that. There's just one bit about Long, though, and I agree with all you've said about the overshadowing and how he is to get into, but I've read most of the papers that you've mentioned. But don't forget that he also wrote a book totally outside the official history called MacArthur as Military Commander, which has the air of all the things I really wanted to say but couldn't bloody well say in the official history. And it includes, I think, the entire text, or at least most verses, of a poem called MacArthur as Dugout Doug. So he obviously captured the feeling of the chaps in the Southwest Pacific area. So there's that blend. There's another side, as it were. There are things you feel you can say and things you feel you can't.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm chairing myself, aren't I? Because you're wandering over the mic. Michael's had his hand up for a while, and David, and come on, I'm not a very good auctioneer. You have to be really obvious. We'll go David, then Michael. Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, we won't. It's 25 to 10.
I was like Peter. I'll be talking about some things this afternoon, which I won't repeat here. But you did refer to
we do.
A little comment about who gives them instructions to the and there was discussion between Long and the government over the shape of the history, and that of course determines what goes in it. And you referred to my book High Command, and there was discussion with the government as to whether there would be such a volume, and somehow as it turned out, there wouldn't be one after the discussion with the government. Part of that would be caused by Shedden. So Shedden's got all the papers, and Shedden had the idea that he would write a book himself. And the instructions to the official historian is he has full access. Shedden knew that, so Shedden put out an instruction that he would give any paper that Long asked for to Long, but he wouldn't tell Long about any papers that he had. So Long had to sort of somehow divine that they existed and ask for them. So that really put a damper on any idea of a volume dealing with higher strategic policy making.
Indeed. What a wily bureaucrat. Go on.
And just the other little point, because I know others want to talk. I'd agree with you completely about the analysis. All these critical issues that have come out of the Second World War that people have written books about, you'll find little hints of that all through Long's history. And you mentioned too many generals, but there are a lot of those. And you won't find that through Bean, but you'll find it through Long.
But often very discreetly. We're making our way over there, aren't we? I think we're in injury time, Tom. But anyway,
I'm going to talk for a long time because I want to keep Peter Stanley late so we can all say he was a tyrant yesterday and he failed.
Self-indulgence.
I just want to make the point that I thought, and I really enjoyed Peter Vanessa's intervention. I think you were a bit rough on Kenneth Slessor. And if you look at the 2 volumes that UQP brought out quite some time ago of his dispatches, because he was the official correspondent, and his analysis in those dispatches and other writings, so they're 2 thick volumes, is quite insightful, particularly the course of the campaign in Greece. And he clearly lived the high life. I think that was his undoing. He wasn't in the Bean tradition. I don't wish to be disrespectful to Charles Bean, but Bean was an austere man. He lived an austere life. Kenneth Slessor wandered around Greece looking and suffering, as did the troops who were being pushed down the peninsula. But he was drinking champagne the whole way.
Was he an intimate of Blamey's? Was Slessor an intimate of Blamey's?
Absolutely. And I think, that's why I asked the question about Blamey yesterday. My own suspicion is that Bean worked very hard to have the appointment of Slessor withdrawn. And had always seen the bishop's son as the right chap for the job and in his tradition. Now, unfortunately, there's no evidence of this, but that has always been my suspicion. And if you look at the very first diaries that Long started keeping once the appointment was made, and they're interesting because he goes around and talks to everybody, but he keeps very careful notes of what he says. And I think he is surprised that he's got the job, and sort of in Slessor's shadow a bit for a while. So I think there's something really fruitful to be gathered from a close study of that very mixed up period. Whether or not Slessor, as somebody was saying yesterday, if Murdoch had been the official correspondent, we wouldn't have had an official history. And if, yes, Peter, and if Slessor had been appointed the official historian, we might have got away with 3 or 4 volumes. Because he wouldn't have had the capacity for the hard years of hard work that Long could endure. But as in the case of Bean, it destroyed Long's health, and he died, like Bean, shortly after he completed his task. And Slessor would never have died from overwork.
No, fair enough. While Tom's moving the mic, can I point out that Gavin Long was also a very austere man. There's stories of him wearing patched clothes. He didn't care about those sort of material things.
That's exactly what Ken Inglis said.
Yeah.
And that's why Ken Inglis, an austere man himself, so liked Gavin Long.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Bill.
You mentioned prisoners of war as a topic in the Second World War. Well, I must admit I'm not one of those who has read the entire official history of the First World War. Is there any real coverage of prisoners of war, of the Germans, or much more difficult in terms of ill treatment of the Turks?
The short answer is no, not much, but one of the great pleasures lately is that there are young people. Kate Ariotti's book on POWs, Australian POWs of the Turks, is coming out in our Army History Cambridge series. And Aaron Pegram is just about to finish his thesis on Australian prisoners of the Germans in the Great War. So those deficiencies, just as David finished off, other people are filling in gaps.
Well, I was actually fishing for the advertisement for the Army one.
Oh, nice one, Bill. Okay. Right. Oh.
Very quick comment, Peter, on Gavin Long's study of MacArthur. My mentor at Duke, Theodore Rock, knew Gavin Long and always held that book up as an absolute exemplar. And it was widely regarded in the US as the first real step in puncturing the sort of godlike aura that surrounded MacArthur, particularly at West Point. So there's an interesting connection, trans-Pacific.
Indeed, thanks. Peter Pedersen's book, Monash's Military Commander, is an echo of and direct tribute to that book. So he has effects.
Peter, I'd just like to shed a little bit of light that I've got in my book on the relationship. This is what I wrote about Slessor, Bean, Blamey and Long. Bean also had reservations about Slessor. In Canberra, he met with the commander of the 2nd IAF, Tom Blamey, now knighted and holding the rank of Lieutenant General. He was unlikely to hear anything positive from Blamey about Slessor, as the correspondent had become the commander's enemy through his reporting in the Middle East. Bean told Trelaw that Slessor, as the official correspondent, and this is a quote, had the ball at his feet if he wanted it, but he doubted if Slessor had compiled any records. Bean thought the job may have to go to someone more adept at collecting information and suggested Long be given the appointment. So he did make that.
Exactly. Thank you. Finish? No, there's nothing final I want to say except that I think somebody should pick up this ball and run with it. Thank you.
Would you please thank Peter?